The past has a funny way of catching up to us when we least expect it. For Michael Thompson, a self-made millionaire surrounded by wealth and success, life should have been perfect. He had it all: fancy cars, high-rise apartments, and more money than he'd ever dreamed of. Michael Thompson, a man in his early 40s, sat in his expansive New York City penthouse, staring out at the skyline. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky, casting a glow over his luxurious surroundings. He had everything that money could buy: expensive cars, a sprawling apartment, and wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But deep down, he felt a void that none of his material possessions could fill. Despite his outward success, something essential was missing. As he swirled his glass of bourbon, his mind wandered to a simpler time, back when life was about more than just the market, money, and business. A time when he still believed in love and hope, before ambition overtook his heart. Memories of his high school years came flooding back, days filled with excitement, drama, and youthful dreams. Michael was popular back then, a promising athlete with a bright future, but what he cherished most was his relationship with Emily Johnson, a sweet girl with a gentle smile and a heart full of kindness. They were inseparable, sharing their first kiss under the bleachers and dreaming of the future together. Yet life has a way of pulling people apart. After graduation, Michael's family moved away abruptly due to his father's business ventures, and their connection was severed. He never saw her again, and the love they shared faded into a distant memory. While Michael built his empire in the bustling city, Emily's life took a very different path. She stayed in the small town upstate, where they had once roamed the fields and shared secrets. Now, she worked as a waitress at a small cozy diner, serving coffee and pie to regulars who adored her sunny demeanor. Her days were filled with routine, but behind her warm smile, she carried a quiet sadness, a lingering ache for what could have been. Emily had never married, never left that little town. Part of her was still waiting, clinging to the hope that one day fate would bring Michael back to her. As she refilled the coffee mugs of her regulars, Emily would occasionally glance out the window, lost in thought. She wondered if Michael ever thought of her. Did he remember their shared dreams? Did he think about the life they could have built together? A small house, a family, a simple, happy life. She tried not to dwell on it, but the thought always lingered at the back of her mind. Her life had become a series of mundane routines: morning shifts at the diner, evening walks along the same quiet streets, and nights spent alone in her modest apartment. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Still, the question haunted her: did Michael ever look back? Michael, meanwhile, seemed to have it all: a mind sharp for business, an impressive portfolio, and a reputation that commanded respect in the market. Yet late at night, when the city buzzed below him, he found himself scrolling through social media, searching for a glimpse of Emily's life. He never found anything concrete, just bits and pieces, fragments of a life lived out of the spotlight. The image of her face, older but still beautiful, haunted him. He'd often think about taking a drive upstate, just to see her, just to know. But fear held him back. The fear that too much time had passed, that the connection was gone. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she'd forgotten him completely? Despite his success, Michael's life felt empty, a hollow existence filled with meetings, deals, and high-rise apartments that didn't feel like home. He spent his days surrounded by wealth, but felt poorer than ever when it came to happiness. The mind that had built a real estate empire and owned the most luxurious cars and houses couldn't stop fixating on one thing: the girl he left behind. There was a time when he would have traded everything just to have that moment back, the moment when he should have fought to keep her in his life. But now, years later, he was just a stranger to her, or so he thought. In the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed too loud, Michael would close his eyes and imagine her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when they talked about the future. He'd recall the last time he saw her, their tearful goodbye in front of her house, the promise that they'd keep in touch. a promise they both failed to keep. His wealth couldn't buy back time or erase the regret he carried like a weight on his shoulders. He tried to focus on his next project, a new apartment complex that would redefine luxury living, but his mind kept drifting back to that little town, to a small house on a quiet street, where a piece of his heart still lived. Emily, meanwhile, clung to her memories too. She kept a small, faded photo of the two of them on her nightstand. It was from prom night, taken just before they left for the dance. They looked so young, so full of hope and excitement. She'd never shown it to anyone, never spoken of him to her friends at the diner. He was her secret, her private memory of a love that felt so real, so pure. Sometimes she'd stare at that photo and wonder what he was doing, if he was happy, if he'd found someone else. She'd shake her head and smile sadly, knowing it was foolish to hold on. Yet she couldn't bring herself to let go. Their worlds were miles apart, one filled with the hum of the city, the other with the quiet of a small-town diner. But the distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a chasm created by years of silence and missed chances. Yet neither of them could truly move on. Michael, with his towering wealth and penthouse views, and Emily, with her modest apartment and diner shifts, were trapped in the past, held prisoner by the same question, what if? On a rainy evening in New York, Michael sat alone in his apartment, watching the droplets streak down the glass. A sudden urge took hold of him, a longing that wouldn't be silenced. He grabbed his car keys and decided then and there he was going back. He didn't know what he'd find, or if Emily would even want to see him. But he had to try. After all these years, he needed to see for himself if there was still something there, still a chance to reclaim what they'd lost. Meanwhile, Emily was wrapping up her shift at the diner, saying goodbye to the regulars as the rain poured outside. It was a quiet night, just the way she liked it. She wiped down the counter, lost in thought, as she always was at the end of her shift. Little did she know, the one person she thought she'd never see again was heading her way, carrying with him a wealth of emotions, memories, and the hope of a comeback that might just change everything. As Michael drove through the rain, his mind raced with memories. He'd left the city in his sleek black car, a symbol of the wealth he'd accumulated over the years. But tonight, the luxurious vehicle felt like a stark contrast to the uncertainty building in his chest. The familiar streets of his old hometown appeared around him, quaint houses with neat lawns, modest apartments tucked between small shops, and the quiet, peaceful vibe he had left behind so long ago. It was strange being back, almost like stepping into a story he no longer belonged to. Yet, here he was, following a thread of hope that seemed too fragile to grasp. The diner came into view, a small, cozy place nestled at the corner of Main Street, its warm glow spilling out into the rainy night. He parked the car and hesitated, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. What was he doing here? He hadn't planned to stop, hadn't planned for any of this, but something pulled him toward the place, a feeling he couldn't shake off. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, the rain immediately soaking through his expensive suit. As he pushed through the diner's door, the bell above it jingled softly, and he found himself staring into a scene that felt almost frozen in time. The smell of fresh coffee and apple pie filled the air, the chatter of a few customers mingling with the clinking of cutlery. Michael scanned the room, his gaze landing on a waitress with her back to him. She was setting a plate of food in front of an elderly couple, her voice soft and pleasant as she wished them a good evening. Something about her seemed so familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He sat down at a corner booth, trying to be inconspicuous, and watched as she moved around the diner with practiced ease. It wasn't until she turned around and glanced his way that his heart skipped a beat. Emily. She looked different, older, wiser, perhaps a little tired, but it was her. There was no mistaking those kind eyes, the gentle smile. He felt a surge of emotions, a mixture of excitement and nerves. What were the odds, after all these years, to find her here, in the very place he used to come with his friends after school, eating burgers and dreaming of the future? She hadn't noticed him yet, and a part of him felt relieved. What would he even say? How could he explain the years of silence, the wealth that separated them now like an unbridgeable chasm? Emily glanced in his direction, her eyes lingering on him for a moment before she continued to the next table. He watched as she took an order, jotting it down with a distracted smile. Something in her expression caught his attention, a flicker of sadness maybe, or was it just exhaustion? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the girl he'd once loved was standing right there, just a few feet away, and yet she felt miles out of reach. Swallowing hard, Michael picked up the menu, pretending to study it as his mind raced. Should he say something? Should he let her walk away? Just as he was about to speak, she approached his table, her notepad ready. "What can I get for you tonight?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Michael froze, the words catching in his throat. Up close, he could see the lines of worry etched lightly on her face, the subtle signs of a life that hadn't been easy. She didn't recognize him. Why would she? He looked so different now, dressed in a tailored suit, his hair neatly styled. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Just coffee, please." She nodded, scribbling down his order before walking away. As he watched her go, Michael felt a pang of regret. He should have said something, should have told her who he was. But what if she didn't want to see him? What if she had moved on, built a life without him? He stared out the window, watching the rain blur the neon signs outside. He'd come all this way, yet now that he was here, he didn't know what to do. Lost in thought, he almost didn't notice when she returned, setting the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Here you go," she said softly, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. The connection was instant, electric. For a split second, Michael thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but it was gone just as quickly. She turned away, heading back to the counter. He watched her the entire time, his mind spinning. She looked different, more grounded somehow, like life had shaped her in ways he couldn't begin to understand. He glanced around the diner, taking in the worn-out booths, the faded photos on the wall. This place was her world now, and he was just a stranger passing through. But he didn't want to be a stranger, not to her. Michael stayed longer than he intended, nursing his coffee as the diner slowly emptied out. He kept glancing at her, hoping for a moment, a sign that she remembered, but nothing came. Eventually he sighed, leaving a generous tip before standing up to leave. Just as he reached for his coat, a loud clap of thunder echoed outside, followed by a sudden downpour. The rain came down in sheets, the wind howling against the windows. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," Emily said lightly, glancing up from where she was cleaning the counter. Michael forced a smile, shrugging. "Guess so," he replied, his voice casual despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. He sat back down, unsure of what else to do. He couldn't leave now, not when there was still so much unsaid. As the minutes ticked by, the diner grew quieter, the other customers leaving one by one, until it was just the two of them. Emily finished wiping down the tables and gathered her things, preparing to leave. Michael's heart pounded as he watched her pack up, his mind screaming at him to say something, anything, before she walked out of his life again. But fate intervened. Just as Emily turned to go, her bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the floor. Michael was on his feet in an instant, kneeling down to help her pick up the scattered items. She let out a soft sigh, muttering an apology as she bent down beside him. They worked in silence, gathering pens, a hairbrush, a few crumpled receipts, and then Michael saw it, a small, worn-out photo, lying face down on the floor. He picked it up carefully, turning it over, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a picture of two teenagers, smiling and holding hands. His heart skipped a beat. It was them. A flood of memories rushed back. Prom night, the music, the way she'd looked at him when they danced. He stared at the photo, his hands trembling slightly. Emily glanced up, her eyes widening as she realized what he was holding. Their gazes locked, and in that instant, it all came rushing back. Recognition, shock, and something else, something deeper, flashed across her face. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, unable to tear his eyes away from hers. "Yeah, Emily, it's me." For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stood there, staring at each other as the rain drummed against the diner's windows. Michael could hardly believe it. After all these years, he was standing face to face with the girl he'd once loved more than anything. And Emily, she looked stunned, almost as if she'd seen a ghost. I can't believe it," she murmured, her voice shaky. Her eyes were wide, and Michael could see the emotions swirling in them. Shock, confusion, maybe even a touch of anger. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. How could he explain? Where did he even begin? "Yeah, it's really me," he said softly, holding up the photo. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." The words felt inadequate, empty. What could he possibly say to make up for all the lost time? Emily shook her head slowly, as if trying to process what was happening. She took a small step back, her gaze flicking from the photo to his face. "Why are you here, Michael?" she whispered. There it was, the question he'd been dreading. Why now? Why after all these years? He took a deep breath, lowering the photo and shoving his hands into his pockets. I came back to see what I'd lost," he admitted, his voice low and rough. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, and he saw a flash of pain cross her face. "What you lost?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Michael, we were kids. You left. You didn't even say goodbye properly." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and he winced. She was right, of course. He'd left without looking back, too caught up in his family's move, his new life, his ambitions. He'd thrown himself into building a career, accumulating wealth and chasing the next big thing. "I know," he said quietly, looking down. "I made a mistake. I should have fought harder. I should have." He trailed off, feeling the weight of all the things left unsaid. Emily stared at him, her expression unreadable. The diner was silent now, just the two of them standing there, the distance between them feeling impossibly vast. "You should have what?" she asked softly, almost to herself. Her voice was strained, full of something raw and unguarded. Michael met her gaze, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. "I should have held on to you," he said simply. "I should have stayed." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily looked away, biting her lip. She turned slightly as if to put some space between them, but then paused. "You left, Michael. You built a whole life somewhere else," she whispered. "You didn't just lose me. You moved on." Her words cut deep, and he felt his chest tighten. How could he explain that he hadn't moved on, that no amount of wealth, no number of penthouses, cars, or high-rise apartments had ever filled the void she'd left behind? He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze imploring. "I thought about you all the time, Emily," he said softly. "Every single day. I didn't know how to come back. I was afraid I'd messed everything up beyond repair." She looked up at him then, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And now, what's changed?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael's heart ached at the sight of her, so strong, yet so fragile. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling slightly as if he were afraid she might disappear. "You," he murmured, "you're still here, and I'm tired of running away." For a long moment, Emily just stared at him, her expression conflicted. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "Michael, she started, but he cut her off, his voice urgent. "Just give me a chance to explain, please." There was desperation in his tone, a raw sincerity that he hadn't felt in years. She hesitated, then sighed softly. "Okay," she said quietly. "Talk." Michael swallowed, taking a deep breath. He wasn't used to feeling so exposed, so utterly at her mercy. But this was Emily, the girl who'd once held his hand under the bleachers, who'd believed in him when no one else had. "I left because I was scared," he began slowly. "Scared that if I stayed, I'd hold you back. My family was moving, and I thought you'd be better off without me, that I'd just become a burden." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Stupid, right? I thought I was doing the noble thing, but really I was just a coward." Emily's gaze softened, but she didn't speak. She just watched him, letting him spill his regrets. "And then, life happened," he continued, his voice strained. "I got caught up in the market, the money, the hustle. I kept telling myself I'd come back one day." "But you never did," Emily whispered, her tone gentle now. Michael nodded slowly. "No, I didn't. I convinced myself you'd moved on, that you didn't want to hear from me, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it got to come back." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "But I never stopped thinking about you, Emily. I never forgot." She looked down at the photo still clutched in his hand, then back up at him. "You really hurt me, Michael," she said quietly. He flinched, the pain in her voice almost unbearable. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with old wounds, regrets, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Then slowly, Emily let out a long breath. "You were my whole world," she murmured, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. "When you left, it felt like everything fell apart." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the past. Michael felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring slightly. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he said again, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her eyes full of unshed tears. "Sorry won't change what happened," she whispered, "but I guess it's a start." She glanced down, shaking her head slightly. "What do you want, Michael? Why are you really here?" He hesitated, then took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want a second chance," he said softly, "to make things right, to show you that I'm not the same person who left you behind." Emily blinked, surprise flickering across her face. "A second chance?" she repeated, almost incredulous. Michael nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes, please, Emily, just give me one more chance." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly, "but no promises, Michael. No guarantees." He nodded quickly, relief flooding through him. "Of course," he murmured. "Just thank you. Thank you for even considering it." Emily gave him a small, tentative smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to bridge the years between them. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle by the time they stepped outside. Michael held the door open for Emily, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. She hesitated for a moment, glancing up at the sky before walking through. It felt surreal, being here with him, after all this time. As they stood on the sidewalk, the quiet town wrapped around them like a familiar, comforting blanket. Michael shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing sideways at her. "Would you, like to go for a walk?" he asked, softly. Emily raised an eyebrow, the corners of her mouth twitching upward. "A walk, huh?" she murmured. "After all these years, you want to take me for a walk in the rain?" Her tone was teasing, but there was a hint of something else. Something almost like nostalgia. Michael chuckled softly, shrugging. "Yeah, I guess so," he said. "I mean, it's not a fancy dinner or anything, but it's a start." Emily's smile widened, and for a moment it felt like they were kids again, bantering and teasing each other. Without another word, she nodded, and they began walking slowly down the deserted street side by side. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly in the stillness. They walked in silence for a while, the damp air filled with the scent of rain and wet pavement. Michael glanced around, taking in the small town charm he'd almost forgotten. Quaint houses, little shops, and the quiet calm that was so different from the relentless pace of the city. "It hasn't changed much," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emily glanced at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "No, it hasn't," she agreed. "This place doesn't change much at all." There was a wistfulness in her voice, and Michael felt a pang of regret. Maybe that was part of the problem. Everything had stayed the same here, except for him. They passed by the old movie theater where they'd had their first date, a rickety little place that had seen better days. Michael slowed down, staring at the faded marquee. "Remember when we came here to see that terrible horror movie?" he asked, a small grin tugging at his lips. Emily laughed softly, the sound like music to his ears. "Yeah, you screamed louder than I did," she teased, her eyes twinkling. Michael let out a mock groan, shaking his head. "I did not," he protested, but his smile widened. The memory seemed to bridge the years between them, pulling them closer together. They continued walking, the conversation flowing more easily now. Michael found himself talking about his life in the city, the highs and lows, the excitement and drama of the business world. He told her about the wealth he'd accumulated, the lavish cars and apartments, the constant hustle of the market. But as he spoke, he realized how hollow it all sounded. What did it really mean, all that money and success, if he didn't have someone to share it with? Emily listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She just listened, and somehow that made him want to open up even more. "Honestly, I don't know how I got here," he confessed after a while, his voice soft. "I kept telling myself I was chasing success, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered." He glanced sideways at her, his gaze earnest. "I thought that if I just had enough money, enough power, I'd be happy, but I wasn't. Not really." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Sometimes we chase things that aren't meant to fill us," she murmured. "We think wealth, success, all of that will give us what we want. But at the end of the day, it's the simple things that really matter." Michael swallowed hard, her words striking a chord deep inside him. "Yeah," he whispered, "I think I'm finally starting to realize that." They fell silent again, the only sound the soft patter of rain and their own footsteps. After a moment, Emily stopped, turning to face him. "Michael," she said quietly, her gaze piercing. Why did you really come back? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze head on. Because I couldn't keep running, he said simply. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't care. Her eyes softened, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of hope in them. And what do you want now? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael stepped closer, his heart pounding. I want to know if there's still something here, he murmured. If we can start over. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shiver down his spine. Emily sucked in a breath, her gaze locked on his. Michael, I don't know, she whispered. So much has changed. I know, he said softly, but some things haven't. I haven't. He swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers. Emily, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I want to try. I want to be the person I should have been for you all those years ago. His voice was raw, filled with emotion. Emily's gaze wavered, and he could see the uncertainty, the conflict in her eyes. She took a small step back, shaking her head slightly. Michael, it's not that simple, she whispered. You can't just come back and expect everything to go back to the way it was. I'm not asking for that, he said quickly, his tone urgent. I'm asking for a chance, just one chance to prove that I'm serious, that I'm not going to run away again. Her eyes met his, and for a long, tense moment, they just stood there, the rain falling softly around them. Then, slowly, Emily let out a long breath. Okay, she murmured, her voice barely audible. One chance. But if you hurt me again, Michael, if you disappear. She trailed off, her gaze hardening. I won't forgive you. Michael nodded quickly, relief and hope flooding through him. I won't, he promised softly. I swear, Emily, I'm not going anywhere. She stared at him for a moment longer, as if searching for something in his eyes. Then slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said again, her voice steadier now. We'll see. Michael felt a surge of emotion, hope, joy, and a fierce determination to make things right. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick. Thank you for giving me a chance. Emily looked up at him, her gaze softening. Don't thank me yet, she murmured. Just don't mess it up. I won't, he vowed, squeezing her hand gently. They stood there for a moment, the rain falling softly around them, the world fading away. It was just the two of them, standing at the edge of something new and terrifying and beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning sun peeked through the clouds as they sat on a bench overlooking the small town. Michael glanced at Emily, who looked peaceful, even if a bit hesitant. They'd spent the whole night talking, wandering through the empty streets, sharing memories and regrets. Now, the town was beginning to stir to life, lights flickering on in the houses, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. Michael felt a strange sense of contentment, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the market, the wealth, or his next big deal. He was just present. So what happens now? Emily asked softly, breaking the silence. Michael turned to her, his expression serious. Now, he said slowly, I show you that I'm not the same person I was. Emily raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Oh, and how are you going to do that? There was a challenge in her tone, but Michael welcomed it. I'm going to be here, he replied simply. I'm not going to disappear this time. I'm going to stick around, no matter what. He paused, taking a deep breath. If you'll let me. Emily looked down at her hands, her expression thoughtful. You say that now, but she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. What if you get bored? What if you decide that small-town life isn't for you? Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Michael felt his chest tighten. He reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. Emily, listen to me, he murmured, his gaze intense. I'm not going to leave. I'm not going to run. I want to build something real. With you. He hesitated, then added quietly, if you still want that. The uncertainty in his voice caught her off guard. For so long she'd thought of Michael as this larger-than-life figure, someone who moved through the world with confidence and power. But here he was, sitting beside her, looking unsure, human. She swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside her. Michael, it's not that I don't want that, she said softly. It's complicated. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. I know, he said quietly, but we can work through it. Together. Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she she whispered. But I need time, Michael. I need time to figure things out. Relief flooded through him, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Take all the time you need, he murmured. I'm not going anywhere. He gave her a small, tentative smile. I'm here, Emily, for as long as it takes. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then slowly, she leaned back against the bench, letting out a soft sigh. You always knew how to say the right thing, she murmured. Michael chuckled softly, his smile widening. I guess some things never change, he teased lightly. Emily rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the town slowly came to life around them. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, and Michael savored it, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at Emily, taking in the way the soft morning light played across her face, highlighting the freckles on her cheeks. She looked beautiful, real, the kind of beauty that didn't fade with time. Hey, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to him, raising an eyebrow. Yeah? He hesitated, then smiled. How about breakfast? Emily blinked, then let out a surprised laugh. Breakfast? She repeated, amusement coloring her tone. Michael shrugged, grinning. Yeah, breakfast. I seem to remember there's a little diner around here that serves the best pancakes. Emily's smile widened, and for a moment it felt like they were back in high school, teasing and flirting like they used to. Oh, you mean the diner I work at? She asked dryly. Michael pretended to think for a moment, then nodded. Yep, that's the one, he said cheerfully. Emily shook her head, laughing softly. You're unbelievable, she murmured, but she stood up, brushing off her jeans. All right, come on, Mr. Big City. Let's get you some breakfast. Michael grinned, standing up beside her. Lead the way, he said warmly. They walked back to the diner, their shoulders brushing occasionally, the silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities. It felt easy, comfortable, like they were slipping back into a rhythm they'd almost forgotten. As they entered the diner, Emily turned to him, her expression serious. Michael, she said quietly, this doesn't mean, I'm not saying we're... She struggled to find the right words, and Michael nodded quickly. I know, he said softly. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to spend time with you. Her gaze searched his, and for a moment, he thought she might pull away. But then she nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Okay, she murmured, one step at a time. Michael felt his heart swell with hope. One step at a time was more than he'd dared to dream of. They spent the morning together, talking and laughing like old friends. Michael found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, sharing stories and memories, listening as Emily talked about her life, her hopes, her dreams. It was different. In the city, conversations were always rushed, always transactional. But here with Emily, it was like time slowed down. He realized just how much he'd missed this, missed her. By the time they left the diner, the sun was high in the sky, and the world seemed brighter, more alive. Emily glanced at him, her eyes soft. Thanks, Michael, she said quietly, for everything. Michael shook his head, his smile gentle. Don't thank me, he murmured. I should be the one thanking you for giving me a chance. They stood there for a moment, the world quiet around them. Then, slowly, Emily nodded. Well, we'll see how it goes, she said lightly, but there was warmth in her voice, a hint of something that made Michael's heart leap. Yeah, he agreed softly. We'll see. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope, because maybe, just maybe, they really could find their way back to each other. What would you do if you came face to face with someone you thought was lost forever? Would you take the risk of opening old wounds for the chance of a new beginning? And what about Emily? Should she trust Michael again after all these years? Have you ever felt that strange mix of hope and fear when reconnecting with someone from your past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you give a second chance to a long-lost love? Or would you close that chapter for good? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more stories like this one. Did you like it, or would you like to make any adjustments? Let me know if you'd like to modify something or add any other questions.